In the spring of 1358, medieval France stood on the brink of total collapse. The 100 Years' War had been raging for over 2 decades, transforming the once prosperous French countryside into a wasteland of burned fields and devastated villages. The region of Beauvais, situated approximately 50 miles north of Paris, would become the epicenter of one of the most significant peasant uprisings in medieval history. The political landscape was equally chaotic. King John II of France had been captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, leaving his young son, the Dauphin Charles, to manage a kingdom in turmoil. The French nobility, rather than uniting to protect their lands and people, were embroiled in their own political schemes and power struggles, showing little concern for the commoners' suffering. The countryside had become a dangerous place where roaming bands of mercenaries, known as the Free Companies, terrorized villages with impunity. These soldiers, left unemployed during periods of truce in the 100 Years' War, sustained themselves by pillaging the peasantry. The nobles, who were supposed to protect their subjects, often retreated to their fortified castles, leaving the rural population defenseless. Beauvais and its surrounding areas were particularly vulnerable. The region's strategic location between Paris and the English-held territories in Normandy meant it frequently endured military campaigns, requisitions, and pillaging. The fertile plains of the Isle de France, traditionally the breadbasket of the kingdom, had been repeatedly ravaged, leading to widespread famine and desperation among the peasant population. Adding to this perfect storm of calamities, the Black Death had swept through the region just a decade earlier, killing nearly half the population and disrupting the traditional feudal labor system. The surviving peasants, known derisively as jacques by the nobility, after the Jacques bonhomme nickname given to French peasants, faced increasing demands from their lords who attempted to maintain their income and lifestyle despite the demographic catastrophe. The economic situation was equally dire. The French currency had been repeatedly devalued to finance the war effort, while taxes continued to rise. The peasants were caught in an impossible situation, required to pay higher taxes with increasingly worthless money, while their ability to produce food and goods was severely compromised by the constant warfare and raids. In these conditions, the region of Beauvais, with its network of small villages and market towns, became a powder keg of social tensions. The peasants, far from being the docile servants portrayed in noble chronicles, had begun to develop a sense of collective identity and shared grievances. They had access to information about political events through traveling merchants and had witnessed successful urban uprisings, particularly in Paris under Etienne Marcel. This combustible combination of political instability, economic crisis, social upheaval, and the nobility's failure to fulfill its protective role would soon ignite into the fierce uprising known as the Jacquerie, marking a pivotal moment in medieval French history and challenging the very foundations of feudal society. At the heart of the 1358 peasant uprising stands Guillaume Caille, a figure whose remarkable leadership abilities would earn him a place in medieval history. Known alternatively as Jacques Bonhomme, though this was a generic term for French peasants, Caille emerged from humble origins to become an unexpectedly sophisticated military commander. Contemporary chronicles, despite their noble bias, grudgingly acknowledged his exceptional ability to organize and lead the peasant forces. Caille's background remains somewhat mysterious, but historical records suggest he had some military experience, possibly serving in local militia units during the 100 Years' War. His tactical knowledge and understanding of medieval warfare proved invaluable in transforming a scattered rebellion into an organized military force. Under his leadership, the peasant army demonstrated surprising discipline and strategic coherence, successfully attacking numerous noble strongholds across northern France. On the urban front, Etienne Marcel, the powerful provost of Paris's merchants, emerges as a complex figure in the revolt's narrative. As the leader of Paris's bourgeoisie and the head of the city's government, Marcel initially saw the peasant uprising as an opportunity to advance his own political agenda against the royal authority. His support provided the revolt with crucial legitimacy and potential urban allies, though his commitment to the peasants' cause was always pragmatic rather than ideological. The primary antagonist, Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, played a pivotal role in the revolt's tragic conclusion. A skilled political manipulator with claims to the French throne, Charles initially presented himself as a potential ally to both the peasants and the Parisian bourgeoisie. His true nature would be revealed in his treacherous dealing with Guillaume Caille and his brutal suppression of the revolt. The French nobility, collectively, formed a formidable opposition to the peasant movement. Notable figures included the Count of Foy and the Captal de Buc, who led the noble counteroffensive against the rebels. These aristocrats, viewing the peasant uprising as an existential threat to their privileged position, responded with unprecedented violence and coordinated military action. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles V of France, played a more nuanced role in the conflict. While officially opposing the revolt, his weak position following his father's capture by the English forced him to maneuver carefully between various factions. His primary concern was maintaining royal authority in a period of crisis, leading him to alternatively negotiate with and oppose both the peasants and their urban allies. Lesser-known but significant figures included local peasant leaders who coordinated with Cale across different regions. These local commanders, whose names are largely lost to history, were crucial in spreading and maintaining the revolt across northern France. They transformed local grievances into a broader movement that threatened the entire feudal structure. The clergy of the region also played a complex role, with some parish priests sympathizing with their peasant congregations while others remained loyal to their noble patrons. Their accounts, preserved in church records, provide valuable insights into the revolt's dynamics at the local level. Through the interaction of these various figures, the Jacquerie evolved from a local uprising into a significant challenge to medieval social order. The personal ambitions, tactical decisions, and ultimate fates of these key players would shape not only the course of the revolt, but also its lasting impact on French society and historical memory. The Jacquerie Revolt represents a pivotal moment in medieval history where the fundamental tensions of feudal society erupted into open conflict. At its core, this uprising embodied the struggle for human dignity and social justice within a system designed to perpetuate inequality. The peasants' rebellion emerged from a complex web of grievances that had reached a breaking point by 1358. The most pressing burden facing the peasantry was the crushing weight of taxation. The French crown, desperate to finance its war effort against England, imposed ever-increasing taxes on an already impoverished population. These taxes took multiple forms: direct monetary levies, forced contributions of food and supplies, and emergency war taxes that became permanent fixtures. The peasants found themselves caught in an impossible situation, required to sustain both their families and an expensive war while their resources dwindled. The traditional feudal obligations added another layer of hardship to their existence. Peasants were bound by an intricate system of duties to their lords, including labor services, corvée, portions of their harvest, and various fees for using essential facilities like mills and ovens. These obligations, established during more stable times, became unbearable during the crisis of the mid-14th century. Lords, facing their own financial difficulties due to the war, often increased these demands rather than providing relief. Perhaps the most immediate threat to peasant survival came from the marauding bands of mercenaries who terrorized the countryside. These free companies, composed of unemployed soldiers during periods of truce in the 100 Years' War, operated with virtual impunity. They would descend upon villages, demanding protection money, stealing crops and livestock, and often engaging in wanton violence and destruction. The nobility's failure to protect their peasants from these raids represented a fundamental breach of the feudal contract. The specter of famine loomed constantly over the peasant population. The combination of war-ravaged fields, disrupted agricultural cycles, and the aftermath of the Black Death created a perfect storm of food insecurity. Crop failures became more frequent as farmers struggled to maintain production under difficult conditions. The situation was exacerbated by nobles who continued to demand their share of increasingly scarce harvests. Disease remained a persistent threat, with populations weakened by malnutrition more susceptible to various illnesses. The traumatic memory of the Black Death, which had devastated communities just a decade earlier, remained fresh. Medical knowledge was limited, and what healthcare existed was largely inaccessible to the peasant class. The psychological impact of these combined pressures cannot be understated. Peasants witnessed the complete breakdown of the feudal covenant. While they fulfilled their obligations, their lords failed to provide the promised protection and justice. This crisis of legitimacy in the feudal system became a central theme of the revolt. The peasants began to question not just specific grievances, but the fundamental fairness of a social order that condemned them to perpetual servitude. The revolt also highlighted the emerging class consciousness among the peasantry. Through their shared sufferings and grievances, they developed a sense of collective identity and common purpose. This awakening challenged the traditional medieval worldview that presented social inequality as divinely ordained and immutable. These overlapping conflicts created an explosive situation where violence became increasingly seen as the only possible response. The peasants' decision to rise up, despite the enormous risks, reflected their desperate circumstances and their growing recognition that the system itself, rather than just individual lords or policies, was the source of their suffering. Their revolt would become a powerful symbol of resistance against systemic oppression, resonating through centuries of social struggle in France and beyond. The daily existence of a medieval French peasant in the mid-14th century was characterized by unrelenting hardship and stark social division. From dawn to dusk, the jacques labored in the fields, their lives governed by the rhythms of agricultural seasons and the demanding obligations of the feudal system. Their homes were humble wooden structures with thatched roofs, often consisting of a single room where entire families lived together with their few livestock for warmth during harsh winters. The typical peasant diet was monotonous and often insufficient. Rye bread formed the foundation of their sustenance, supplemented by porridge made from various grains. Vegetables grown in small garden plots provided some variety, though much of their produce went to paying feudal dues. Meat was a rare luxury, usually limited to special occasions or when an animal was too old to work. The poorest peasants might go weeks without consuming any animal protein beyond the occasional egg or cheese. In contrast, the nobility resided in fortified castles and manor houses, enjoying a life of relative comfort and abundance. Their tables were laden with diverse foods, including fresh meat, fine wheat bread, and imported spices. This stark disparity in living conditions served as a daily reminder of the social hierarchy that defined medieval France. The peasants' workday began before sunrise, with women rising first to rekindle the hearth fire and prepare the day's first meal. Men would then head to the fields, using primitive tools that made agriculture extremely labor-intensive. Children joined in the work as soon as they were physically capable, helping with tasks like watching livestock or gathering firewood. The elderly, if they survived long enough, continued contributing to household tasks until they were physically unable. Housing conditions reflected the severe class distinctions. Peasant dwellings were dark, smoky, and cramped, with earthen floors and few, if any, windows. Furniture was minimal, often limited to a rough table, benches, and straw-filled mattresses. By comparison, noble residences featured stone walls, multiple rooms, glazed windows, and elaborate furnishings, creating an almost entirely different world within the same society. The social structure was rigidly hierarchical, with interaction between classes strictly regulated by custom and law. Peasants were expected to show deference to their social superiors through specific gestures and forms of address. They were forbidden from wearing certain colors or materials reserved for the nobility, and their movements were restricted by various feudal obligations that tied them to their lord's land. Education was virtually non-existent for peasant children, who learned life skills through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. The ability to read or write was rare among the jacques, though some might have acquired basic numeracy skills necessary for trade. This educational divide helped maintain the social order by limiting opportunities for advancement. Religious life provided some respite from daily toil, with Sundays and numerous saints' days marked by mandatory church attendance and prohibition of work. However, even these occasions reinforced social hierarchies, with nobles occupying privileged positions in church and peasants relegated to standing in the back. The material conditions of peasant life had deteriorated significantly by 1358. Increased taxation, war-related destruction, and the demographic collapse following the Black Death had created an impossible situation. Lords demanded ever higher payments from a diminished population, while failing to provide the protection that justified their privileged position in feudal society. This daily experience of grinding poverty, constant labor, and visible inequality, combined with the nobility's evident failure to fulfill their social obligations, created the explosive conditions that would ultimately ignite the Jacquerie Revolt. The uprising represented not just a reaction to specific grievances, but a fundamental rejection of a social system that condemned the majority of the population to lives of perpetual hardship, while a privileged minority enjoyed the fruits of their labor. If you are shocked by the conditions that led to the revolt, tell us in the comments. Do you think the peasants had any other choice? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel to follow our further explorations. The Jacquerie Revolt erupted with sudden ferocity on May 28, 1358, in the small town of Saint-Lô-d'Esserent, marking the beginning of one of medieval France's most significant peasant uprisings. The initial spark occurred when a group of peasants, pushed beyond endurance by noble exploitation, confronted local knights who had been pillaging their village. This confrontation quickly escalated into open rebellion, as years of accumulated grievances found violent expression. The revolt spread like wildfire through the Beauvais region. Within days, the uprising had engulfed hundreds of villages across the Île-de-France. The peasants' ability to organize so quickly surprised the nobility, who had always regarded them as a disorganized and submissive mass. News traveled rapidly through market networks and parish communities, with messengers moving between villages to coordinate actions. By early June, the rebel army had swelled to thousands, drawing participants from all sectors of rural society. Under the leadership of Guillaume Caille, the movement achieved a level of military organization that alarmed the noble class. Caille established a rudimentary command structure, dividing his forces into units and coordinating their actions across a broad territory. The rebels demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication, targeting noble strongholds systematically rather than engaging in random violence. The uprising reached its peak in early June, when the peasant armies launched coordinated attacks against castles and manor houses throughout northern France. Their tactics were ruthless and effective. They would surround a noble residence, overwhelm its defenses through sheer numbers, and then methodically destroy everything that symbolized feudal authority. The rebels showed particular zeal in burning feudal records, the documents that detailed their obligations and debts to their lords. A crucial development came when the rebels formed an alliance with elements of the urban bourgeoisie, particularly in Paris, where Étienne Marcel saw an opportunity to advance his own agenda against royal authority. This alliance provided the peasants with supplies, information, and a degree of political legitimacy they had previously lacked. Some town militias even joined the rebels in attacking noble strongholds. The nobles, initially caught off guard, soon began to organize a response. Charles II of Navarre emerged as a key figure, presenting himself as a potential mediator while secretly preparing to crush the revolt. He arranged a meeting with Guillaume Caille, ostensibly to negotiate terms. The meeting was a trap. Caille, displaying perhaps his only significant tactical error, attended with a small escort. He was immediately seized and executed, likely subjected to torture before his death. The loss of their principal leader dealt a devastating blow to the rebel cause. Charles of Navarre moved quickly to exploit this advantage, launching a series of brutal attacks against peasant forces now lacking central coordination. The noble counteroffensive was marked by extraordinary cruelty, with entire villages put to the sword regardless of whether their inhabitants had participated in the uprising. The final phase of the revolt witnessed scenes of terrible vengeance as the nobility reasserted its authority. Thousands of peasants were killed, often in ways designed to terrorize the surviving population. The nobles made examples of rebel leaders, subjecting them to public execution and displaying their bodies as warnings against future rebellion. Villages associated with the revolt were burned, crops destroyed, and survivors forced to pay crushing reparations. By late June, barely a month after it began, the main phase of the Jacquerie was over. The speed of its suppression matched the rapidity of its spread. However, isolated pockets of resistance continued for several weeks, particularly in areas where rebels could find refuge in forests or where local terrain made noble cavalry less effective. The aftermath of the revolt brought significant changes to rural society. The nobility, shaken by the scale and ferocity of the uprising, strengthened their fortifications and became even more isolated from their peasant subjects. The brutal repression left deep scars in the collective memory of rural communities, while also demonstrating the ultimate limitations of peasant military power against organized noble forces. This sequence of events, from spontaneous uprising to organized rebellion, from initial successes to ultimate defeat, would establish a pattern that future peasant revolts would follow. The Jacquerie demonstrated both the potential power of peasant solidarity and the terrible consequences of its failure, leaving a legacy that would influence social relations in France for centuries to come. The Jacquerie Revolt left an indelible mark on medieval French culture, generating a rich tapestry of oral traditions, literary works, and historical interpretations that continue to resonate through the centuries. The cultural impact of this uprising manifested in multiple forms, from peasant songs to noble chronicles, each offering distinct perspectives on this momentous event. The term jacques itself presents a fascinating study in linguistic appropriation and cultural resistance. Originally used by the nobility as a derogatory term, derived from Jacques Bonhomme, Jack Goodfellow, it was meant to mock the peasants' simple clothing and perceived lack of sophistication. However, in a remarkable act of cultural defiance, the rebels embraced this label, transforming it from an insult into a badge of honor. This linguistic reclamation demonstrated the peasants' growing class consciousness and their ability to subvert noble attempts at social control. Oral traditions played a crucial role in preserving the memory of the revolt among the peasant population. Songs and ballads, passed down through generations, told stories of brave resistance and brutal repression. These cultural expressions often contained coded messages and subtle critiques of feudal authority that might have been dangerous to express more directly. While few of these oral traditions were recorded at the time, fragments survived in later folk collections and local customs. Contemporary chronicles, primarily written by religious scribes and noble supporters, painted a drastically different picture of the events. Jean Froissart, one of the most important chroniclers of the period, described the rebels as evil people who acted like mad dogs. His account, while biased, provides valuable insights into how the ruling class perceived and sought to delegitimize the uprising. The chronicler's tendency to emphasize the violence of the peasants while minimizing noble brutality reflects their role in shaping historical memory to serve elite interests. The Church's response to the revolt was complex and multifaceted. While higher clergy generally condemned the uprising, supporting the divine right of the nobility to rule, some parish priests showed sympathy for their peasant congregations. Church records reveal instances of local clergy providing sanctuary to rebels or even participating in the uprising. These conflicting responses reflected broader tensions within medieval religious institutions between their role as spiritual guides and their position within the feudal power structure. Intellectual discussions of the revolt among medieval scholars often focused on questions of natural law and social order. Some theologians and philosophers debated whether resistance to unjust authority could be justified within Christian doctrine. These debates contributed to evolving medieval theories about governance and social justice, though they rarely challenged the fundamental premises of feudal hierarchy. The revolt also influenced medieval artistic expression. Illuminated manuscripts from the period sometimes depicted scenes from the uprising, though usually from a noble perspective. These visual representations, while biased, provide valuable information about medieval warfare, clothing, and social relations. The tension between artistic convention and historical reality in these works offers modern scholars important insights into medieval mentalities. Literary references to the Jacquerie appeared in both contemporary and later medieval works. The uprising became a powerful symbol in French literature, representing both the dangers of social disorder and the potential for collective action against oppression. Writers often use the revolt as a backdrop for exploring broader themes of justice, power, and social transformation. The intellectual impact of the Jacquerie extended beyond France's borders. News of the uprising spread through merchant networks and diplomatic channels, influencing discussions of social order throughout medieval Europe. The revolt became a reference point for later theorists and revolutionaries considering questions of popular sovereignty and resistance to authority. Cultural memory of the revolt evolved significantly over time. While initial accounts emphasized chaos and violence, later interpretations, particularly during the French Revolution and subsequent periods of social upheaval, often portrayed the Jacquerie as an early expression of popular democracy and class struggle. This reinterpretation demonstrates how historical events can be reimagined to serve different cultural and political purposes across centuries. The linguistic legacy of the revolt enriched French vocabulary and idiom. Various phrases and expressions referring to peasant resistance or social uprising trace their origins to this period. The term Jacquerie itself entered multiple European languages as a general term for peasant revolt, demonstrating the event's lasting impact on cultural consciousness. This rich cultural and intellectual heritage of the Jacquerie Revolt provides modern historians with valuable insights not only into the events themselves, but also into how medieval society processed and remembered significant social upheavals. The multiple, often contradictory narratives surrounding the revolt reveal the complex interplay between power, memory, and cultural expression in medieval France. The Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 emerged within a complex web of interconnected events and influences that shaped medieval European society. Far from being an isolated incident, the uprising was deeply influenced by and connected to broader regional and continental developments that created the perfect conditions for social upheaval. The 100 Years' War played a pivotal role in setting the stage for the rebellion. This prolonged conflict between England and France had devastating effects on the French countryside. The constant movement of armies, both friendly and hostile, resulted in widespread destruction of crops, livestock, and property. The war's financial demands led to crushing taxation, while military defeats, particularly the capture of King John II at Poitiers in 1356, created a crisis of political authority. The presence of unemployed soldiers and mercenaries, who formed predatory free companies, further destabilized rural areas and contributed to the peasants' desperation. Urban unrest, particularly in Paris, provided both inspiration and potential allies for the rural rebels. The Parisian uprising led by Etienne Marcel demonstrated the possibility of successful resistance against traditional authority. Marcel's movement showed how different social classes could coordinate their actions to challenge the existing power structure. The communication networks between city and countryside allowed news of urban resistance to spread, encouraging rural communities to consider similar actions. The Black Death, which had swept through Europe in the late 1340s, fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape. The massive population loss created labor shortages that challenged traditional feudal relationships. Surviving peasants began to demand better conditions and higher wages, while nobles attempted to maintain their traditional rights and income despite the changed circumstances. The plague's demographic impact also led to abandoned villages and disrupted agricultural production, creating additional economic stress that would contribute to the revolt. Contemporary peasant movements in other European regions influenced and paralleled the Jacquerie. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though occurring after the Jacquerie, shared many similar causes and characteristics. Earlier movements in Flanders, where urban workers and rural peasants had successfully challenged authority, provided models of resistance. These various uprisings were connected through trade networks and traveling merchants who spread news and ideas across medieval Europe. The influence of religious dissent also played a role in shaping the revolt's ideology. Various reform movements within the church had questioned social hierarchies and promoted more egalitarian interpretations of Christian doctrine. While the Jacquerie was not primarily religious in nature, these currents of religious thought contributed to the intellectual environment that made questioning traditional authority possible. The revolt was also shaped by changing economic patterns across Europe. The growth of trade networks and market economies had begun to transform rural society, creating new expectations and tensions. Peasants who participated in local markets were increasingly aware of economic inequalities and their own potential power as producers of essential goods. International trade routes served as conduits not just for goods but for information and ideas. Merchants traveling between different regions brought news of social movements, successful resistance tactics, and alternative forms of social organization. This circulation of information helped create a broader consciousness among the peasantry of their shared conditions and potential for collective action. The Jacquerie was also influenced by changes in military technology and organization. The experience of warfare during the 100 Years' War had demonstrated that well-organized infantry could effectively challenge mounted knights. This military knowledge, combined with the presence of veterans among the peasant population, contributed to the revolt's initial military successes. The revolt's interactions with external factors continued even after its suppression. News of the uprising spread throughout Europe, influencing how nobles in other regions dealt with their peasant populations. The brutal repression of the Jacquerie became a warning to other potential rebels, while simultaneously serving as a lesson in what to avoid in future uprisings. These various external influences and interactions reveal the Jacquerie as part of a broader pattern of medieval social unrest. The revolt emerged from and contributed to an international context of warfare, economic change, social mobility, and ideological transformation that characterized the 14th century. Understanding these connections helps explain both why the revolt occurred when and where it did, and why its impact resonated far beyond the boundaries of northern France. The Jacquerie Revolt, despite its brutal suppression, left an indelible mark on French and European history that resonates through the centuries to the present day. Though the immediate outcome was devastating for the peasant population, the uprising's long-term impact would influence social movements, political thought, and cultural memory in profound and lasting ways. As the first major peasant revolt in medieval France, the Jacquerie established a powerful precedent for collective action against oppression. It demonstrated that the peasantry, traditionally viewed as a passive and submissive class, could organize effectively and pose a serious challenge to established authority. This revelation permanently altered the relationship between nobles and peasants, even if the immediate result was increased repression. The revolt's influence on subsequent social movements cannot be overstated. Later uprisings, including the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and the German Peasants' War of the 1520s, drew lessons from the Jacquerie's experiences. The organizational techniques, the importance of leadership, and the need for urban allies became part of a shared toolkit for popular resistance. Even during the French Revolution, for centuries later, memories of the Jacquerie influenced revolutionary rhetoric and action. Perhaps the revolt's most significant legacy was its demonstration of the potential power of popular organization. The ability of peasants to rapidly coordinate across a wide geographical area, establish effective leadership structures, and mount significant military operations revealed capabilities that few had imagined possible. This organizational achievement would serve as a model for future movements and challenge assumptions about the capabilities of ordinary people to act collectively. The Jacquerie's fundamental questioning of feudal power structures marked a crucial moment in European social history. While the revolt did not immediately transform the feudal system, it exposed its vulnerabilities and contradictions. The peasants' actions demonstrated that feudal authority was not divinely ordained and immutable, but could be challenged and potentially overthrown. This ideological breakthrough would have lasting implications for European political thought. The revolt's legacy can be traced through various historical movements for social justice and equality. Its influence extends beyond peasant uprisings to include labor movements, democratic reforms, and various struggles for human rights. The basic questions raised by the Jacquerie about the nature of authority, the rights of common people, and the legitimacy of resistance to oppression remain relevant to contemporary social movements. In French historical memory, the Jacquerie occupies a complex position. While initially portrayed solely as an outbreak of peasant savagery, later interpretations, particularly following the French Revolution, began to view it as an important precursor to modern democratic movements. This evolution in historical interpretation reflects changing attitudes toward popular resistance and social justice. The uprising also left a lasting impact on French culture and literature. The term Jacquerie entered the French language as a general term for peasant revolt, while the figure of the rebellious peasant became a recurring motif in French art and literature. These cultural expressions helped preserve the memory of the revolt and its significance for future generations. Modern scholarship continues to find new relevance in studying the Jacquerie. Historians examine it for insights into medieval social structures, the dynamics of popular protest, and the development of class consciousness. The revolt provides valuable lessons about how disadvantaged groups can organize for collective action, even under highly repressive conditions. The Jacquerie's legacy also includes important lessons about the challenges and risks of social movements. The revolt's ultimate failure highlights the importance of sustainable organization, reliable alliances, and careful strategic planning. These lessons have been studied and applied by subsequent movements for social change. In the realm of political theory, the Jacquerie contributed to evolving concepts of popular sovereignty and legitimate resistance to authority. The rebels' actions and demands helped establish the principle that rulers have obligations to their subjects, and that failure to meet these obligations could justify resistance. As we reflect on the Jacquerie from our contemporary perspective, its relevance to modern struggles for social justice becomes clear. The courage of medieval peasants who dared to challenge an oppressive system, their ability to organize despite severe constraints, and their vision of a more equitable society continue to inspire and inform current movements for social change. Their story reminds us that the struggle for justice and dignity has deep historical roots, and that each generation must confront its own versions of these fundamental challenges. While the specific context of the Jacquerie belongs to medieval France, its spirit of resistance and hope for social transformation remains vitally relevant to our own time. If you were impacted by this story of medieval resistance, be sure to like, comment on your reflections, and share with your friends. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel for more fascinating stories about the struggles and transformations of the Middle Ages. See you on the next trip to the past.